I'm curious about your time at Bagram as the wing commander, what that was like then. What years were you the Bagram wing commander?
March 08 to April 09, so 13 and a half months.
And that time period, I'm trying to align that with what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, because it ebbs and flows. But I did MC-12s in Afghanistan, and one of those things, one of the McIntyre guys, I remember supporting him on the frequency. He was a lawyer on the radio as far as reading off the rules of engagement to make sure these guys were cut off, surrounded, had no means of escape. And then I think they were dropping, is it a V5, GPU-38 V5, the low collateral, carbon fiber bomb.
Yeah.
Which really had no impact whatsoever. But that conflict was a stark contrast to then my time in OIR, where, the gloves were off at that point.
Yeah.
And I guess with that, here's the kind of the tie-in, which I thought was interesting, you brought up earlier. We were so afraid to make one mistake or have one person, one unit make one mistake that would then land on every front page across the world. What was it like leading a wing at that time period?
Well, people ask me, hey, what was your best assignment, Gen Holmes? And I tell them, well, you may not believe this, but it was the year 13 and a half months at Bagram. I hated being away from my family. There's time I can never get back, but I had the opportunity to put everything I had learned up to that point to use in a place where we believed it really mattered, with a team that was really focused on accomplishing that mission. So at Bagram, the 82nd and then the 101st had been given RC East, and they were transitioning in late 2008 from RC East and 101st running the whole war across Afghanistan to splitting up into 4 RCs and bringing in another U.S. RC down in the Kandahar area. So we flew mostly in North Afghanistan, except on weekends, because NATO didn't fly weekends. So on the weekends, we would go down to Kandahar and pick up some extra lines and do that. But we covered the whole country. We covered all the forces that were deployed, NATO and largely U.S. Army. The Marines came in a little later, and then we did the build-up and the preparation. So we were building up for the surge in Afghanistan. We had a group at Kandahar. We laid the groundwork for them to become a wing, and shortly after I left, they became a wing. At Kandahar, we moved the A-10s down there. So in most of my time at Bagram, we had a squadron of Strike Eagles, and at one point, I think we had 28 Strike Eagles there. We had a squadron of A-10s, and we got up to 24 A-10s there. We had Slick C-130s. We had EC-130s. We had a Navy EA-6B detachment that was doing counter IED work for the most part, and we had the rescue contingent. And then down at Kandahar, we were flying Bacon and RPAs and H-860s. And then as the country moved down into the Southwest and the Marines came in, we had to pick up that extra rescue mission. So we brought in additional rescue forces and pushed that envelope out all the way into the Southwest corner. And it was a year of transition, and we dropped a lot of bombs. Probably 40% of our flying was in support of National Mission forces, most of that at night, and then some in the daytime. And then the rest was CAS for traditional forces. And, one of the differences between in Afghanistan and Iraq was in Iraq, you had roads. In Iraq, if a unit got in trouble, you could drive to help them. In Afghanistan, you couldn't. Units were out there, and it would be hours, maybe days, before anybody could get to them. And so you really relied on air power as armed overwatch for those units to be able to keep them alive. And, you've probably been to Bagram, and as you step out of the fighter ops, there's a sign in there that says, the only thing that matters today is an 18-year-old with a rifle that we would slap on the way out. And, that hasn't always been what we had trained for. But while we were there, everybody in that wing, that's what we were focused on, was trying to keep our American forces and our coalition forces alive against people on the ground that were trying to kill them. We also had provincial reconstruction teams, I think 6 of those, and they were either half Army and half Air Force, or half Army and half Navy, usually commanded by a sailor or an airman with a Army S-3. And they were out trying to do hydroelectric power or solar power projects, build schools, and do those things. They were made up of people from all across the Air Force. And the airmen that I lost during my time at Bagram were drivers and people in the provincial reconstruction teams, bomb loader from Ellsworth, people that had been tasked into the AAF to come do that kind of work, and were killed by IEDs out on the very terrible roads. Yes.
Gosh, it's crazy just to think, 20 plus years Afghanistan, where we are today, and obviously a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, lives lost, lives changed. Yeah, that's a whole other thing in and of itself. And then I'm trying to think, I was there in 2012, and then to hear the stories of buddies who were there in 2020 and 2021.
Well, the 10 guys that went in there will tell you, they could pretty much do, whatever they wanted. They came in and built Bagram, moved into the Russian tower.
Right.
There weren't many of them. The fight was largely local and around them. And then, gradually the complexity of the rules will ebb and flow. You end up getting rules so thick that you can't understand them all. And so a new CFAC will come in and cut it down. And then over time, you add things back in, and then a new CFAC comes in and cuts it down. But, the rules are important. I would tell every new unit that got there that, look, I'm trusting you to follow these rules. And these rules link you directly through the Constitution of the United States to a presidential order to use force in defense of the United States and the American people. They're the difference between you and the people you're fighting, is that you're linked through a constitution to a national order to do this. As long as you stick to those rules and do your best to operate within those rules, I'll have your back wherever we go. It's my fault too. And whoever you end up in front of, I'll end up there with you. If you break those rules, you're on your own, was kind of the talk that we had. And the other thing I learned during the course of a year is that the other reason for those rules is to help people go home with their honor clean. So at the end of a deployment, a year, you drop a lot of bombs, you kill some people, you're going to deal with that for the rest of your life. And if you follow the rules, you can go home with your honor clean and know that you did those things and you were part of a constitutionally driven organization that decided to employ violence in defense of the nation and its interests. And you can still be the same person, that you were while you were doing that, while you were a granddad and doing the other things that you're doing. If you get sideways with those rules, that's when you come up against the moral injuries, that haunt people the rest of their lives.